The brochure promised a secure community. The website boasted family-friendly living. The iron gate at the entrance declared in bold letters what Evan Brooks wanted desperately to believe, that behind these walls nothing bad could touch him. After years of drifting from apartment to apartment, each one louder and more chaotic than the last, this neighborhood felt like exhaling for the first time. Clean sidewalks stretched between homes that seemed to mirror each other in their perfection. Identical mailboxes stood at attention along the curb. Cameras perched on every corner, their unblinking eyes sweeping slowly across manicured lawns. This was the kind of place where newspapers arrived dry, where children played until the streetlights flickered on, where the worst thing that could happen was a trash bin left out past collection day. Hey everyone, if you're watching this, I want to hear from you. Comment your city below. Stories like this happen everywhere, and I want to know where you're watching from. Subscribe for more true story-inspired HOA thrillers you won't hear anywhere else. Karen Whitfield welcomed him personally on move-in day. She arrived with a leather portfolio tucked under her arm and a smile that seemed practiced to the millimeter. Her handshake was firm, professional, the grip of someone accustomed to controlling conversations. She told him he would feel very safe here, and Evan believed her completely. He didn't notice the way she emphasized the word feel, as if safety itself were something manufactured rather than earned. The HOA handbook landed on his kitchen counter with a thud heavier than his lease. Quiet hours stretched from 9 at night until 7 in the morning. Visitors required registration 24 hours in advance. Delivery drivers followed approved routes mapped out in an appendix thicker than most instruction manuals. Even garage doors had guidelines. Open no longer than 15 minutes during daylight hours, never after sunset. Evan laughed as he flipped through the pages, assuming that strict rules simply meant fewer problems. Order, he told himself, was the price of peace. At the first welcome meeting, Karen stood at the front of the community center and reminded everyone of the most important guideline. If something feels wrong, she said, report it to the HOA first. We handle issues internally. The room nodded in unison, heads bobbing like a single organism trained to respond. Evan found himself nodding too, swept along by the current of agreement before he even understood what he was agreeing to. The first night brought silence unlike anything he had experienced. No dogs barking in distant yards, no sirens wailing on far-off streets. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as it passed through the development. Evan slept deeper than he had in years, his body finally releasing tension it had carried for so long he had forgotten it existed. Then, just after 2 in the morning, something pulled him from sleep. A low thud echoed from somewhere outside. Then another, closer this time. The sounds weren't loud enough to be alarming, not the kind of noise that would send a reasonable person running for the phone. They were just present enough to unsettle, to plant a seed of doubt in the darkness. Evan lay still, listening, but nothing followed. By morning, the neighborhood looked exactly as it had the day before, pristine, ordered, and utterly silent about whatever had happened in the night. Tom Willis appeared at his door the next afternoon, carrying a pie that smelled of cinnamon and something else, something that might have been obligation. He introduced himself as the neighbor from the house just east, his smile easy and practiced in the way of someone who had given this speech before. "Just wanted to say welcome," Tom said, his eyes darting briefly toward the street before settling back on Evan. Then his expression shifted, the warmth thinning into something more cautious. "One thing," he added, lowering his voice slightly, "if you hear stuff at night, don't stress about it. The HOA takes care of things." "Resident," the voice said, "please return inside. This is an HOA matter." Evan went back through his door, but not because fear drove him. He retreated because the voice had known his address without asking. The next morning revealed something wrong on Maple Court. House number 14 stood empty, its windows dark, its driveway clean enough to suggest no one had ever lived there at all. No realtor sign decorated the lawn, no moving truck had left tire marks on the pavement. The house simply looked switched off, as if someone had reached inside and removed whatever made it a home. Tom Willis stood across the street with his arms folded, watching Evan study the emptiness. "They moved," Tom said before any question could form. Evan asked if it had happened last night, and Tom nodded once, his face carrying the resignation of someone who had stopped asking questions long ago. "You get used to it," Tom said, but his voice suggested he never really had. That afternoon, an envelope appeared beneath Evan's door. Inside, Renee had left photocopies of documents that should never have existed outside the HOA office. Incident logs detailed complaints and responses in clinical language. Internal notices described procedures Evan had never seen in any handbook. A checklist titled After Hours Resolution Protocol listed steps in numbered order, and one line had been circled in red ink. Step 4 read Temporary Resident Relocation, with a parenthetical note that added Voluntary Preferred. At the bottom of the page, Karen Whitfield's signature curved across the line designated for authorization. Evan finally understood what safety meant in this neighborhood. It didn't mean protection, it meant removal. The thud that night didn't come from down the street. It came from next door, from Tom's house, close enough that Evan could feel the vibration through his walls. He stood in his dark living room with his phone in hand, listening to raised voices and the soft whine of the security truck approaching. He could stay quiet and follow the rule that everyone followed. He could pretend he heard nothing and wake up to another empty house on the street. Or he could do the one thing the HOA couldn't control once it started. He dialed 911 and waited to see what happened when real authority crossed that gate. The dispatcher didn't hesitate. Officers were en route, she told him, and instructed him to stay on the line. Evan expected the security truck to jam the signal somehow, to cut the call before help could arrive. Instead, something unexpected happened. The thud stopped. The voices vanished. Silence returned to the street, but it felt different now, panicked rather than controlled, the quiet of people scrambling rather than people obeying. Red and blue lights appeared at the community gate within minutes. For the first time since Evan had moved in, the gate didn't open automatically. Officer Daniel Moore stepped out of his cruiser and studied the locked barrier with the patience of someone who had seen this kind of obstruction before. Karen Whitfield arrived moments later, slightly breathless but working hard to appear composed. She clutched a tablet against her chest like a shield and informed the officer that this was a private community. "We handle internal disturbances ourselves," she said, her voice carrying the authority she had cultivated for years. Officer Moore didn't raise his voice. "Someone called for help," he said simply. Karen smiled tightly and mentioned that they discouraged unnecessary escalation. The officer looked past her toward the dark houses and the windows where shadows moved behind curtains. "Escalation already happened, you just hit it." Neighbors began emerging from their homes, first as silhouettes framed in doorways, then as people stepping forward into the flashing lights. Renee walked toward the gate and spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. She had heard it, she said, so had everyone else. Others followed, a man in slippers who looked like he hadn't slept in days, a woman holding her phone with recording app open, Tom Willis standing pale and silent at the edge of the growing crowd. Karen tried to speak, but voices rose and drowned her out. Years of enforced silence cracked open in a matter of minutes. Officer Moore demanded access to the HOA's security vehicle, and what he found inside changed everything. Monitors displayed live feeds from cameras mounted on streets, porches, and interior angles that homeowners had never known existed. A log labeled after-hours actions scrolled across one screen, listing addresses and times and outcomes in neat columns. One entry flashed red with a single word beside it: Maple Court, resolved. Evan recognized the house immediately. Karen didn't scream when the handcuffs closed around her wrists. She simply kept repeating that no one understood how this community worked. Officer Moore read the charges in a calm voice: unlawful surveillance, coercion, impersonating authority, obstruction. As officers escorted her past the neighbors she had controlled for so long, not a single person looked away. By morning, news vans lined the street where the security truck used to patrol. Residents spoke openly, many of them for the first time since moving in. Evan stood on his porch watching officers carry equipment out of the HOA office, box after box of monitors and hard drives and documents that would fuel investigations for months. He had moved here believing safety meant walls and gates and rules enforced by people who promised order. Now he understood something different. Real safety was never silence. Real safety was accountability, the knowledge that when something went wrong, speaking up wouldn't make you the next empty house on the block. The neighborhood would never be quiet again. And that, Evan realized, was exactly how it should be. The sunrise that followed felt different from any Evan had experienced since moving in. Light spread across the neighborhood slowly, revealing a landscape transformed by what had happened in the darkness. Police cruisers lined the entrance where the security truck used to idle. The HOA gate stood locked in its open position, its mechanical arm raised and held back with caution tape that fluttered in the morning breeze. Officers moved from house to house, knocking on doors not to intimidate or issue warnings, but to ask questions that residents had been forbidden to answer for years. People answered. Some cried as they spoke, their words tumbling out in fragments that officers patiently pieced together. Some apologized for their silence, for looking away when neighbors disappeared, for nodding along at meetings when they knew something was deeply wrong. Some spoke for the first time in years, their voices rusty from disuse but growing stronger with each sentence. The quiet that defined this community wasn't peaceful anymore. It was simply gone, replaced by something messier and louder and infinitely more human. Inside the HOA office, investigators uncovered what residents had never been allowed to see. Filing cabinets held incident reports that labeled ordinary behavior as non-compliant, a teenager playing music too loudly, a couple arguing about finances, a single mother working late shifts that caused her to forget trash collection day. Each report followed a template documenting the offense and the response in language designed to sound reasonable while describing actions that were anything but. Video archives filled hard drives stacked in a back room, hours upon hours of footage capturing late-night interventions that the HOA called resolutions. Security personnel approaching homes in darkness, conversations held on doorsteps where residents stood in pajamas and confusion, documents signed under porch lights by people who didn't understand what they were agreeing to until it was too late. Scripts had been written for every scenario, laminated cards that security officers carried in their pockets, teaching them how to issue threats without ever sounding threatening. The language was careful, almost gentle, full of phrases about community standards and mutual cooperation, but the meaning underneath was clear: comply or disappear. Everything had been documented with meticulous precision. Nothing about it all was legal. What Karen Whitfield called safety was a system designed to remove people without witnesses, without questions, without any record that something terrible happened right next door. The truth about House 14 on Maple Court emerged within days. The family hadn't moved because they wanted to. They had been relocated under pressure that mounted slowly and then all at once.
Their teenage son had gotten into a fight at school, a normal adolescent conflict that happened in neighborhoods across the country every day. But in this community, that single incident became evidence of behavior that endangered property values. The HOA approached them first with concerned questions, then with pointed reminders about community standards, then with fines that accumulated faster than any family could pay. Surveillance increased until they felt watched every moment of every day. Security trucks parked outside their home for hours at a time. Finally, Karen herself arrived with an offer, a fast sale at below market value.
The HOA's insurance carrier reviewed the allegations and dropped coverage immediately, leaving the organization exposed to liabilities that would eventually consume every asset it possessed. Board members resigned in carefully worded letters that claimed ignorance of any wrongdoing, each one insisting they had trusted Karen's leadership without questioning her methods. But investigators found emails and meeting minutes and signatures on documents that proved otherwise. Everyone had known. Everyone had participated. Everyone had believed the system would protect them from consequences. The phrase "following policy" stopped appearing in statements once attorneys explained that policies designed to harm people offered no legal protection. Defense strategies shifted to silence, but silence came too late to matter. The truth had already escaped the dates. Karen Whitfield stood trial 3 months after her arrest. She pleaded not guilty to all charges, her attorney arguing that she had created something valuable in that community. Crime rates were among the lowest in the region. Property values had risen consistently for years. Residents had expressed satisfaction in surveys conducted by the HOA itself. Order, the defense claimed, sometimes required difficult decisions. The prosecution presented evidence methodically: surveillance footage, victim testimony, documents signed under duress. Former security officers described training sessions where they learned to identify problem residents and apply pressure gradually. Neighbors testified about the fear that had governed their daily lives, the constant awareness that any misstep could make them the next target. The judge listened to everything before asking Karen a single question that silenced the courtroom. "Did residents have the option to refuse?" she asked, her voice carrying the weight of everything the jury had heard. Karen didn't answer. The pause stretched for seconds that felt like hours, and in that silence, everyone understood what safety in that community had actually meant. It had never been a choice. It had been compliance enforced through fear, dressed up in language about property values and community standards. The verdict came quickly after that. Months passed, and the neighborhood slowly transformed into something unrecognizable to anyone who had lived there before. The cameras came down first, removed by workers who found them in places no homeowner had ever suspected: inside light fixtures, behind doorbell casings, woven into landscaping that had seemed purely decorative. Each discovery brought fresh outrage and fresh relief, the strange comfort of finally understanding how completely they had been watched. The security truck sold at auction to a buyer from another state who planned to convert it into a food truck. The irony wasn't lost on residents who gathered to watch it drive away for the last time. The HOA office sat empty for weeks before the county condemned it for code violations that had somehow never been noticed while Karen held power. Windows grew dusty. The sign was removed. Eventually, the building was demolished to make room for a small park that children would play in without anyone recording their movements. Neighbors began doing things that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. Block parties happened on weekends without permits or prior approval. Grills smoked on driveways while music played loud enough to hear 3 houses away. Kids rode bikes past sunset, their laughter echoing through streets that had once fallen silent when darkness came. Police cruisers passed through openly on routine patrols, and no one felt their stomach tighten at the sight. Officers waved, residents waved back. Authority had become something that protected rather than threatened. Renee Alvarez waved to Evan every morning as he collected his newspaper from the driveway. She had become something of a local hero after the investigation, the woman who had kept documents when everyone else had been too afraid to leave a paper trail. She deflected praise with characteristic humility, insisting that Evan had been the one who made the call that mattered. But they both knew the truth was more complicated. Courage had been collective, even when it felt individual in the moment. Tom Willis finally spoke to Evan one afternoon, approaching hesitantly across the lawn that separated their homes. His face carried the weight of everything he hadn't said during those early days, the warnings he had delivered in code rather than plain language. "I should have said something sooner," Tom admitted, his voice heavy with regret that time would slowly lighten but never fully erase. Evan considered the apology and everything that lay beneath it. Tom had been afraid, just like everyone else. Fear was reasonable when the consequences of speaking up included losing your home and your community overnight. The courage to resist had to build slowly, gathering strength from small moments of solidarity until it became strong enough to overcome the inertia of compliance. "You did say something," Evan told him, "eventually, and that matters." Tom nodded slowly, accepting the grace being offered without quite believing he deserved it. The gate was removed entirely on a Saturday morning that felt like a celebration. Crews arrived with equipment and took apart the structure that had defined the community's entrance for years. Residents gathered to watch, some bringing coffee and lawn chairs as if attending a sporting event. When the final piece came down, someone started clapping, and the applause spread until the whole crowd joined in. No guards would check identification at that entrance anymore. No loudspeakers would issue orders to residents who dared step outside at the wrong hour. No rules would be whispered in darkness, enforced by people who operated outside any accountability. Evan stayed in the neighborhood despite everything that had happened there. Friends from outside the community questioned his choice, wondering why he would want to remain somewhere with such a painful history. But Evan understood something they couldn't see from the outside. This neighborhood wasn't the same place it had been when he moved in. It had transformed through trauma into something more honest than it had ever been before. The streets still looked the same. The houses still stood in their neat rows, their mailboxes still identical, their lawns still green in summer and brown in winter. But the feeling had changed completely. Neighbors talked to each other now, real conversations about real problems instead of careful exchanges designed to avoid triggering surveillance. People disagreed openly and resolved conflicts without fear that someone was documenting every word. Children grew up understanding that safety came from community, not control. Evan sometimes sat on his porch in the evening and thought about how easily he had believed the promises on that brochure. Security seemed so simple then. Walls and gates and cameras, rules enforced by people who claimed to have everyone's best interests at heart. He had wanted so badly to feel protected that he hadn't questioned what protection actually meant. Now he understood the difference between safety and control. Control required silence and compliance, and the constant fear that stepping out of line would bring consequences. It demanded that people suppress their instincts, ignore their observations, and trust authority figures who had never earned that trust. Control felt like safety as long as you never tested its limits. Real safety was messier and more complicated. It meant knowing that when something went wrong, you were allowed to speak about it without becoming a target. It meant trusting that your neighbors would stand with you when authority figures overstepped their bounds. It meant believing that help would come when you called for it, that locked gates couldn't keep accountability out forever, that the truth would eventually matter more than the rules designed to suppress it. Real safety wasn't silence, it wasn't obedience, it wasn't the absence of conflict or the appearance of order maintained through fear. It was knowing that you could speak and someone would answer, that your voice mattered, that community meant more than proximity, something stronger than shared property values, something worth protecting even when protection required courage. Evan watched the sunset paint the sky above his neighborhood, the neighborhood that almost destroyed itself in pursuit of a safety that was never real. He watched his neighbors move through their evening routines without fear, without surveillance, without the constant awareness that someone might be watching and judging and deciding their fate. This place would never be quiet again in the way it had been before. The silence of control was gone forever, replaced by the noise of people living their lives without permission.